cover the modern change management for digital services and products. And we'll have a guest speaker today, Daniel Davidson, who will cover that topic. So we'll go ahead and get started. And I'll let people in as we go here. So let me let some more folks in.
Jason, hi there, it's Daniel. Hi, everyone else.
Hey, Daniel, how you doing? Great.
I'm all right. I had to join as an attendee. It wasn't letting me join as the host. So I don't know if you can just click on me and make me host.
Oh, yeah, I should be able to. Let me try that. Make host. Oops. Cancel. Make co-host. There we go. See if you're good there. You have the
I can share now. That
okay.
Looks like I can share.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. Welcome to this week's Digital Services Forum. We're going to talk about modern change management for digital services and products with Daniel Davidson. So first of all, welcome new members. If you're a new member today, put yourself in your name in the chat and we'll welcome you to the group. So welcome to all the new folks. Again, we have a shared instance for the folks that are new. If you want to take a look at that, you can send John Spurko an email. He'll give you access to that. Quick overview of the vision about the Digital Services Forum. Really, this is run by the Enterprise Architect team here at ServiceNow, really bringing together our customers with our technical leaders and sharing best practices and knowledge around how our customers are using the platform in digital transformation. And the subjects that we talk about in the forum are related to that various aspects. So it's the real world experience of how we actually deploy, work in the platform and using best practices and knowledge from other customers as well. So feel free, this is an open forum, we can share. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. So once Daniel starts his presentation, I'll go ahead and monitor the chat as well. So as I said, today's agenda is modern change management for digital services and products, a pretty significant area for our customers, especially when we look at how change management is changing over time and how it's evolving. I think Dan's going to hit on some key points around that. So looking forward to the discussion here. Just a couple other housekeeping items. You can join the community here and spread the word about the forum. You can send an email to myself or John if you would like to have the word spread around from your teams. And we do post these on YouTube, so you'll be able to see them later as the recording. There are other previous sessions as well out there. So, feel free to go out to our forum community and pull out a lot of the different videos that we've already posted. So again, thank you for joining. And without further ado, I think we'll pull it over to Dan.
Hey, everyone. And it seems like the word is spreading because this forum is so much bigger than last time I presented, which is probably like 3 years ago, I think. I think it was a COVID call where I presented on digital portfolio management with Caitlin, who's the product manager.
It's definitely changed a lot. We have over 1,200 now members. So we've grown we've doubled the membership, by the way. So for those on the call who who want to know, we've really expanded a lot. So again, customers are very interested in the subject, and again, we're getting a lot of traction on it. So yep.
Right, I'm just going to switch across to my screen, and there'll be a slight break while I make sure we're in. Am I sharing my presenter view or my presentee view?
Your presenter.
I've got the right one showing, right?
No, it's the presentee view or presenter view. Sorry. Yeah, there you go.
Are we good now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Right, nice to meet everyone. So the presentation is going to be in 3 main parts. So first of all, it should take about 20 minutes, I think, depending on how much we need to stop and interrupt for questions or whatever, which you're welcome to do, post in the channel. I think, is there a Q&A? Is that how we're doing it? Or are they just posting in the chat?
They can post in the chat or ask questions, either one, but we do prefer the chat initially while you're presenting, and then we can save the end for Q&A for actual discussion. But yeah, just so we don't disrupt your presentation. But yeah, I'll be monitoring the chat as well, so feel free to drop questions in there.
Okay, cool. So the first bit is very short, which is just on kind of positioning where we are with digital product, service, and how change fits into that, and why change is changing, right? What the imperatives around change have been for a while, why that's been accelerated by thinking about services and products. The second part of the presentation is around what we're doing in the change product to enable federated change and other things. And then we'll show you a bit around the change roadmap that we have in planning around what we've got now and what we see with adoption journeys, and maybe what we've got planned for future releases. Again, with the context of changing service management. So without further ado, we should probably kick off. There we are. Save, harbor slide, absorb, memorize, and we'll move on. Okay, so digital product and life cycle. I'm going to skip to the next slide. You can see in here we've got, this is maybe a familiar ServiceNow slide. We've put it in a lot of decks, and it shows full life cycle. And what's really interesting is, for a long time, when we talked about services, we were just talking about the thing on the right. So service and operate. And so things would be delivered into service and then they go into an operational life cycle. So you'd probably do a bit of planning before that happened, but mainly around how it was going to be supported, how the service was going to be supported, or what that service looked like when it went live. And we'd have service life cycle. So we'd plan services, we'd iterate on services, we'd improve services, retire services, replace services. But as we move more into the digital product paradigm, we're seeing that there are people responsible and teams responsible for that whole life cycle. So going through from ideation on one side, thinking about things, developing products. So then we've got like coding, building, testing, planning, handing over to operations, so release and deploy, and the separation of release and deploy, which is really key to change, and we'll touch on that again during the talk. And also then the handover to service. So when it is eventually released, or when things are deployed, that service need to know about those two things. So you've got a much wider life cycle that we need to talk about in terms of the visibility of how we get from there's an idea to we're building the idea, we're writing stories about it, to we're planning when those things are going to be released and what the features are, to we're implementing changes, and maybe those changes are like feature toggled or blue-green. Maybe they're not on when they go into production, but we're still having changes make their way into production. And then eventually we've got a date when we do a release and we switch things on and things change for our end users. And the service teams need to be aware of all that happening. So key to what we're talking about today is around separation of release and deploy. That has a major impact on how we do change. And also with the teams working like this, with teams going end to end, how do we allow these teams that work in a variety of different ways? So teams that are doing, looking after the mainframe, maybe working in quite a traditional way, looking after the AS400s, looking after the core network, versus teams who are doing things like patching, versus teams who are doing things like, complete digital products, end-to-end digital products, and they're using DevOps and they've got application performance monitoring, and, they're making 1,000 changes a day. And everything in between those teams, right? How do we enable change management to work in that paradigm? And so what that involves is a switch away from what we've traditionally got used to in ITIL change types. Going to cover that next. So first survey we've got. What does federated change mean to you guys? I think we're all synced up here. Jason, I think you can pop up the first survey here.
Okay, let me pop that up real quick. All the three questions are in the same one, but we can
yeah.
Can you guys see that?
You get a sneak preview of the questions I'm going to ask later. So just answer the first one for now. And we'll give a couple of minutes to answer that. Okay. It also gives me an idea about when I'm talking, what we need to emphasize as you're answering this, and I see the bars filling up. So yeah. Okay, so while that's just completing, I'm going to talk a little bit about federated change. And we'll go into more detail as we go on, but the question we get asked, right, when I attend exec briefings with, big global companies and even talking to some of our smaller customers, one of the questions that pops up at kind of CXO level is, how do I federate things while I maintain control? So how do I have all these teams sitting around my business that want to do things differently? I have vendors who are doing things differently. I have internal teams that have been brought in by marketing, nothing to do with IT, who are delivering digital products. And they're not following our centralized compliance rules. They're doing what they do because they've been brought in. And then, quite often this, when it goes into the service layer, gets kind of thrown over the fence at IT, saying, now you've got to look after this. So how do we make sure we align those teams and we allow them to federate and give the business the velocity it needs that federation provides and the flexibility that federation provides, whilst we're still able to control? So whilst we still have centralized control, we still have control of our compliance, while we still know the guardrails are being adhered to. So I think we're starting to see, I think most people answer that question now. Okay, so most people, should we, Jason, is there a neat way of publishing it, or should I just read out what the results were?
Yeah, you can read out.
Okay. So about half the people said number one, which was no idea, please leave me alone, right? Which I understand, right? It is something that's new to us, and it is around, how we delivering digital products into a service paradigm. The second most common answer was that people's bosses are talking about that, right? Roughly a quarter of you said people's bosses are talking about that. And that's what I have found talking to customers. Nearly everyone's senior management or exec management is talking about this as a problem, one of the big problems that's facing them. 20% said we're getting there, which is great, right? That means you're looking at federated change, you're looking at ways of doing things. I'm interested to know, out of that group, maybe we can do it at the end of the presentation, I'm interested to know how you're doing that with ServiceNow, whether you're following the same ideas that I'm going to present to you, whether you're doing things differently, whether there's things that I can learn from you, or, or vice versa. And around 8% said they already have a federated process, which is great. So they're in that space looking at federating change so that teams can work at different velocities and have different ways of working. Okay. So in ServiceNow, we have, I just have my screen. We have some technology that allows us to work with federated change, and that this centers around something we call change models. And people are probably in ServiceNow, the more people I talk to are now aware of change models within ServiceNow. So change models allow us to move away from ITIL change types. We can preserve ITIL change types. I'm going to show that in a minute, but they allow us to have the flexibility to move away where it's appropriate and where we want to move away from ITIL change types. And so this is because change managers are serving a wide range of different teams, right? And trying to squash them all into one box doesn't quite work the same way. So the hypothesis is, by breaking down the change processes into components, by allowing that to be built back together in a way that's compliant, we can allow those teams to work how they want to work within the guardrails that the organization has set, maintain control whilst allowing them to federate and have the velocity they need to work in. So we all know the ITIL change types, right? I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much, but for those of you who may not, right, we've got standard change, and standard change are the repeatable changes which are low risk. And what we do is we define them in advance, and then we let teams do them with very little supervision, with no approval. Sometimes little approval fits in there, but generally speaking, and kind of dogmatically speaking, no approval needed for a standard change. And what we do is we review those changes as a group from time to time, periodically, or when something breaks because of them. And we decide whether we want to carry on doing it with no approval. And the problem with that is, if it's not a standard change, it's got to fit in one of the other two changes that we've got. And you can see we've got normal change, which is the big planet. These slides are kind of the planet slides, right? I've done them, it looks a lot like planets to me in my head anyhow. And so we've got most things are fitting within normal change. And that means we have one big monolithic process, which normally has a workflow that you have to kind of squint and scroll a lot to get through, or a flow. And what happens with that is it becomes a bit kind of maddeningly complex, because you've got within that normal change process, you've got to have, if statements, switches, different processes, different tasks that get spawned, different templates that you can use. And there's no real control over, for instance, what templates you can apply to a normal change. You can generally apply whatever template you like to a normal change. And then we've got emergency change, which should be fairly limited. So that's break fix changes. They're changes that we need to do. Sometimes we need to do them in retrospect. In ServiceNow's way of working, they can be unauthorized changes as well. Or they can be changes that we've had to just fix it, knowing that we don't have a change in place, and then we're going back and looking at what change is happening, or we need to make an approval very quickly in the kneecap to make the change happen. And we try and minimize those changes because they're very risky, right? And they are prone to producing service outages. They're also the reason that they're the way we fix service outages as well a lot of the time. And what we have within this paradigm is a whole set of things in ServiceNow that we can use. So we have a state model, which is pretty much now defined and agreed on for ITIL in the industry. So, you know, we have new, we have assess, we have authorize, we have schedule, we have implement, we have view, we have close, right? And the changes go through those stages. Standard change skips the authorized state, but it still gets scheduled. And the problem with that is that end-to-end workflow has to handle things like state transitions and rollbacks. If teams don't do states and things happen, if we need to go back on a state, we need to reset tasks. It also means that things like approvals are embedded in that big monolithic workflow. Even if we're using techniques like approval policy, we still need to embed all the logic into that big workflow. We also have things like task generation embedded in that workflow. It becomes very complex. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to declutter this big normal change workflow that handles most things so that we can be more specific. And by being more specific, we enable the organization to tailor change, to federate change out to specific teams. That could be a digital product team, that could be a particular service that could be doing change in a way which is, or could have a way of doing change which is more appropriate to them. So I'm going to go on to some more planets. So if you look at what's inside these changes, if you start to break them down, we start approaching something we've called change models. And it's not ServiceNow's idea, it's been around for 20 years, right? It was another idea alongside ITIL that we have change models. And so within emergency change in ServiceNow, you have unauthorized change. And I'm not sure if that's quite the right place for it to be, but that's where it is. So that's a change that we didn't approve that we find later. So something changes in the CMDB, or someone changes the amount of RAM on a server, or someone releases some code without a change. And we find out later, we have a process for assuring that the right things happened, even though they didn't happen at the right time. And then in normal change, we have different things happening. So these are just examples. There could be this many, there could be less, there could be more, right? You could have 20 or 30 of these different buckets within normal change. And you can see from looking at this straight away that these things probably don't all follow the same process. So you have things like patching. We do a lot of patching, right? And certain teams, certain services, certain product teams will be doing a lot of patching, right? So teams that work within your kind of middleware layer, teams that work within Windows or, you know, Wintel or Unix or whatever we're doing in their database layer, they'll be carrying out a lot of patching. And that tends to be done. We have a lot of assurance up front, a lot of planning up front. Changes are planned quite a way in advance normally. And then when you come to execute the change, you're doing the same thing repeatedly. And you tend to open multiple changes. At least, even if you're grouping things, you tend to open multiple changes to do patching. So patching tends to be more about scheduling. You have things like infra changes that may need, you know, a very heavy process on approval. They may need a lot of stakeholders in the room to be able to say the change can go ahead because you're patching one of your core routers. You have cloud infra, which is a different beast altogether, right? That could be doing infrastructure as code, which is done in a very, very fast way. You know, instead of changing things, what we're actually doing each time is destroying what's there and recreating it. Ephemeral and immutable cloud resources. We have app changes. So how we change an app is different. And we may need to link a team doing app changes to infra changes. And in a DevOps paradigm, that product, even though it may be a couple of services in your definition, it may not be, that product itself will probably own the whole stack, right? So apart from the very, very base level of infra that they've got there, which is like, you know, your cloud service provider and their core services, that team will be doing the whole release and deploy activity for the infra as code, for the configurations, and for the app itself and the app code itself. So they need to be coordinated. We've also got things in there like DevOps, right? DevOps and some of these other changes will have, and increasingly will have, shift left data. And what that means is they have a lot of data in their own tools, and they have a lot of process in their own tools. They'll be doing planning, they'll have code repos, they'll be doing testing and security scanning, and they'll have a pipeline that automatically deploys the code and checks, or should check, that these activities have met certain thresholds. And they want to move really fast because they're like, our pipeline means that we can't break stuff, more or less all the time. So we shouldn't need to do all this stuff and change. We're just cutting and pasting stuff into change. And at worst, if they're a normal change paradigm, you could find that we're really slowing them down, right? We're having to make them wait until they have change approval boards every 2 weeks. You know, the agenda overruns, they get skipped to 2 weeks afterwards, and like, why do we have to wait 4 weeks, right? And you end up stacking up changes then, and you end up with these teams who are really fast and work best if they can deploy things frequently and small. That's when they break things least. You end up stacking their changes up and deploying it all in one go, as it was never meant to be deployed in that way. And that in itself can cause outages. So actually allowing them to have that velocity, allowing them to have very little lead time, get stuff out quickly, check it works, means that we will have less severe and even less overall impact to service. Okay. We've also got low risk change in there. Probably talk about that one later if I'm not overrunning.
Hey, Dan, I had a question for you, just kind of in the interim here.
Yeah.
Some of our customers are dealing with, especially when it comes to DevOps change, when we're multiple pipelines going at the same time, and how to manage the governance on that, like how customers can help. What I would say is determine what changes need to be pushed at what time with this, with a multiple kind of pipeline DevOps framework going on at the same time. Is that something you've dealt with, or is it something you could comment on?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways of looking at that, depending on how macro micro you're taking that, like multiple pipelines. So across an organization, you will have people doing activities, and you may not want a developer to be running a pipeline at the same time another set of developers running a pipeline, even though those two systems are not interrelated, just because it presents high risk, right? You don't want to change your core banking systems at the same time as you change your customer facing banking app in a bank, right? That might not be the case, by the way. It's just an example I made up just now. But
yeah.
So that's generally to do with looking at blackout windows, and also being able to compare when pipelines run. Now, pipeline runs are tracked through our DevOps tool. So we have a thing called DevOps. We have a product called DevOps, which tracks pipelines running. And we can actually monitor them for conflicts, and we can hold pipelines if there's another pipeline running. It's a little bit more involved and not the scope of what we're talking about today, but we can do that. Now, generally speaking, that's more of a case when you have a set of different people working on the same kind of stack, and you want to make sure those pipelines run sequentially, because you want to make sure the infra is in place before you apply the code or whatever. That's generally done to the left of ServiceNow. That's generally done within a release orchestration tool, which is an area of the market we're not looking at the moment. We're not playing in. There are really good developer tools that are established that run that kind of stuff. So within a product stack, your release orchestration is done within your release orchestration tool, but we can check to make sure that kind of check has been done. And maybe I'll plug something else at the end there. Sorry, Jason, did you have?
That was it. No, thank you.
Okay, so just to add on to that, so this comes down to the separation of release and deploy. So you have activities around planning when you're going to release things, when you're going to switch them on. And those are really your kind of big events that are happening. And those are related to features, right? When you're turning features on, that's the level for digital product that you want to be making your services teams aware. So at this point, this feature will be activated, or this set of features will be activated. When we develop ServiceNow, that's what we do, right? As a product manager, I look at features and I say to the customers, these features are being released, or these features are being deprecated, or these features are being improved. I don't tell the customers about the stories, generally, ever, really. Because we have loads of stories that we've got to write, right? We have stories, we have defects, we have enhancements, we have dependencies, we have all these artifacts that live within the shift left world that people aren't really that interested in. So when you're looking at your business stakeholders, they're talking about release, your big compliance activities. Has it been signed off by the business? Has it been signed off by legal? Have we done an operational handover? Do we know what service is taking this on? Has the handover to them happened? Are we ready to go? Go, no go? Can we go? Is everything in place to go? Let's go, right? Those kind of activities are your release pipeline, and they're release activities, and they're not change activities. So traditionally, people have placed them within change, and that really slows change down, because suddenly you've got meetings where you've got to have 80 people involved, and you're actually signing off a release within a change. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that for a lot of the kind of older, slower moving applications, but for modern digital applications, for high velocity applications, what you want to do is continually be able to release code, because it's like, we know we're good to go with this. We've written stories. The stories are linked to the code's been scanned. We've done our security testing. We've been through UAT, and now we're going to prod with it, and it's switched off, it's feature toggled off, or maybe it's live when we go live with it, but we've already assured that that feature, at the point at which that goes into production, we've switched the feature. So we have a relationship between release, which is looking at features at the top, and then changes, which are really looking at things like defects and stories that developers have been working on, the individual defects, the individual enhancements, the individual stories that make up a feature or change a feature. So just to recap on all that, because I've just covered a lot. Separation of release and deploy. By separating them, you can speed up the change process because you take activities out which are kind of very time consuming and kind of much longer in scope, put them in a release scope, and the change activities then just become around making sure fit for purpose, fit for use, scheduled right, technically sound, tested, secure. We can release it. Oh, sorry, we can deploy it. Okay. So talking about that, I'm just going to do the slide build again on this one. Right. The DevOps change here. So within normal change we had before, we had DevOps within normal change. And that means we need to either vary our normal change process to allow DevOps to work. So we say, okay, we don't need to send it to cab because it's a DevOps change. And that means we need to think quite hard about what we're talking about with our change process. We need to go into normal change and all of its documents and say, there's something different for our compliance teams around how DevOps change works within normal change. So, and then from a technical point of view, we need to change the flows, right? We need to change our business rules. We need to change how normal change works to allow DevOps to work. And that can be a risky thing to do, both from a compliance point of view and from an engineering point of view. And it can be a time-consuming point of view because there's a lot to test and a lot to unpick. The other paradigm, which I see a lot, is we make standard change a bit bigger and we put DevOps in there because it's kind of a standard change because we don't need to. Now, the DevOps change is not a standard change. There are times when operational teams need to be aware that a pipeline's firing, right? You may have a P1 on your on one of your apps at the moment that means you shouldn't be running pipelines, right? So there are times when you need to know about what's happening in operations in your service layer and tell the developers about that. So that's where ServiceNow comes in, because we tie together the information about the pipeline runs. We can halt pipelines using the DevOps tooling that we have. So pipelines in other tools, we can communicate with them and tell them, right, okay, right now, we need a product manager to approve this because there's a P1 in our production systems at the moment. Can we just wait a few hours till that's cleared before we start running our pipelines in? So that requires a level of approval, which means it's not standard change. It could be as well that developers have fallen outside of the thresholds that we want them to fall in for them to be doing that kind of change, right? They might be failing a lot. So we can incorporate things like success scores. A little more on that later. So actually what we end up with, and I hope I've not lost everyone on the way here, but we end up with ITIL change models that work on one side, but we're shrinking them, right? We're taking the other things out of them, and by that, the planets get smaller, right? Normal change gets smaller. The amount of stuff we're doing in normal change becomes smaller. It's going to coexist for a long time within the paradigm. Standard change is still there as well. We will still have server reboots under standard change. We will still have emergency changes. But actually, to the right of that line, we've got all these changes which are specific models. And there is a thing called a change model for normal, standard, and emergency change in ServiceNow out of the box, right? It's been around for a few years now. So you can have a model for those things in ServiceNow, and you can use that, and they work just the same way as they did using change types. But we can also have models for these other types of changes. So we can have a specific model for DevOps, a specific model for an authorized change that actually reviews the change first and then authorizes it. Have a specific model for patching that allows us to work within the patching paradigm to tailor our process to the data they provide or the process they need. So what that allows us to do is to take these things to the right of the line and speed them up, and also make normal change simpler, which means we can look to improve it, we can look to change it, and we can look to take more stuff out of it because we understand more and more about what the normal changes were. But we still have normal change, we still have emergency change, and we still have standard change. It's just, hopefully, we're using them a bit less. So just to kind of recap on this, we've got our planets lined up, and we've got the normal, standard, emergency changes on one side of the line, the ITIL change type still existing. And on the right hand of the line, we've got federated change models. And what we have for these change models, these specific change models, how do we do it? How do we actually make those flow faster? How do we make them more specific so we can use a specific model for a specific service and make it so that it is faster, more stable, more compliant, and we can handle more volume, right? How do we do that? So from a technical point of view in ServiceNow, we have a different set of states for these things. So we have components at the state level that we can wire together to make a model. So instead of a change, like normal change, having all those 7 states in it, we can actually take only 5 of those states and wire them together to make a change model. So we can say, for instance, with DevOps, we're not going to have an assess phase. It's already been done to the left. We have new, we have authorized, which is normally skipped. We have scheduled when the thing's ready to go and the pipeline's waiting to run. We have implement when the pipeline's running. And then we have review and close, which review will happen very quickly and it will close. So we can do changes much faster because of that. And also we have a specific flow for those states. So for DevOps, the way in which the flow works, you'll have a DevOps flow or a set of DevOps flows, which will allow you to be very specific about how DevOps runs. It's not using the normal change flow. It's using a specific DevOps flow, which means when you want to do DevOps or when you want to alter DevOps, how DevOps flows, you don't need to change the normal change flow, which is a big activity, a risky activity, complex activity. For instance, with patching, you can have your own flows as well. And we can actually decouple things like approval policies from this as well. So we have a set of components. We have state model. We have a set of flows. We have approval policies that are specific to that model of change. And we have structured data that's provided, like story data, like test data. And using a combination of those things, that's what makes up the model. So that's what makes up our change model. And I'm going to give an example of that next. So we're going to look again at DevOps. It's a really good example, but you can think of examples where a lot of customers I talk to are using change models now for normal standard and emergency, but they're also using models for things like patching. They're also using models for things like infra, for firewall changes. So starting to spin stuff off and starting to look at doing this change differently, having a specific state model, a specific set of flows, and looking at the data for, say, having a DevOps model, looking at the DevOps data, incorporating into the change and making the change flow faster because we have this data and not affecting their normal change by what they do. So the idea is that we have our change models and we get to do things like automate approvals because we know what type of data we're expecting for that change model. So we can tailor approval policies to make sure that change flows as fast as possible. We can have policy-driven state models. So we can actually start to say, okay, well, this state only applies if these things happen because we know more about that change model. And we can start giving teams the ability to self-optimize, to make suggestions about how their model works without affecting the other teams that are in different models. So what we're doing is we're giving the opportunity to encapsulate this stuff, this way of working in a thing called a change model, and then have technical aspects of it, like the flow that it flows through, the state model it uses, how it gets approved, what tasks get attached, what data is in the change. Wrap that together and have assurance around it, have compliance around it, and say, this is how DevOps change works for our organization, or this is how high velocity elite DevOps change works for our organization, and this is how low velocity DevOps change works. You can mix and match. And all the time while we're doing this, with those components that I talked about, the states, the flows, the approval policies, they can all be reused across different models. So if 2 different models are using the same approval policies, that's fine. If they're using the same states, that's fine. You know, a lot of changes will still use new, assess, authorize, scheduled, implement, review, and close. They'll use a combination of those, not necessarily in the same order, not necessarily the whole lot. Okay. So that's the end of the section on how we're doing federated change in ServiceNow using change models. I think now I'm going to skip forward and we have the second question, which is anyone actually adopting change models right now? If we get the questionnaire up again, survey up again.
Pull up again.
And while we're doing that, there's a lot of stuff in the chat, right?
There is quite a bit, probably a little bit too much to go through, but because there's a lot of commentary too. Our customers are and our members are communicating with each other and answering the questions. So, so it's really good. It's really good cross collaboration there on that. I'll relaunch the poll. And then, by the way, I did save the results, Daniel, as well. So
okay, that's cool. Thank you.
Yes, but I did have a question for you as well. So who is responsible generally for setting up these models at an organization? I think there's different roles that play a part in actually driving these models across the organization. Who do you usually see that does that? Is that the change manager, configuration manager? I mean, who kind of runs that is from your perspective, or is it a multitude of people depending on the model?
Okay, so the operating model that we see has 4 layers. So first layer, you have admins who are responsible for actually building the artifacts, right? So they won't have the SME knowledge that they need to know how a flow works in terms of the steps in a flow, or what the approval policies will be, but they need to be there building stuff for the change managers. So the change managers won't be there like tinkering with the flows. That will be part of the ServiceNow admin team, ServiceNow engineering team. The second layer then you've got is kind of change process owners. So generally there will be a nominated process owner within the business, but there'll also, in larger organizations, there'll be a few people who have, a very deep knowledge of the change process. And so what they'll be doing is looking at the data that they're getting back from change, saying, right, this thing looks like a model to me. I've got a change that's being repeated here, or an area of the business that needs to be working faster or moving faster, looking at things like patching first, looking at things like DevOps, maybe they're using site reliability engineering. There's a need and a want to move in a different way. Or maybe they're just a really fast team working on an app, that needs to be rolled out quickly, and they're kind of screaming at us saying that the normal change process doesn't work. So that comes into the change managers, the kind of change process owners. The next layer down from that is federated change teams, and people may or may not like this idea, but you could have vendors, you could have third parties, you could have teams that actually own a lot of their own change model. They may not own the flows, they may not own the state models, but they may be given the opportunity to wire together a set of states and say, this is what our process looks like, this is what our data looks like, this is the kind of process we want to follow. And they'd work with the change managers, who would then work with the admins to get that stuff built and put together for them. So they would have, you have a kind of catalog of available components, things like approval policies, things like states, already existing change models that someone may just want to say, I want to reuse that one, but I want to have it called something slightly different so that it falls into a different category so we can measure it different. So that's federated teams. And the amount someone wants to federate out to those teams is up to you as customers to do. And then you have change raisers, right at the other end, who are people who are agents who are raising changes day to day, or automatically raising changes because they're running pipelines. And that's the other group.
Awesome.
I had a few more slides, but I think we've got to the edge of the time that I'd like to, because I want to do Q&A. I don't want it just to be me talking. So what's the best way? So, okay, we've got the survey results back. So we use models for ITIL change types, normal, standard, emergency, 61% of people, which is great because you've kind of done the first steps, right? And hopefully from there, you're starting to look at things like using flow instead of workflow, or maybe even using state-specific flows. Now, we have got a set of recordings that we're going to put out in the next couple of months around change adoption journey and steps that we would take to do this. What I wanted to do on this call is just use the opportunity to talk around how this ties in with services, right? And digital services and digital products. So there's 17% are using models beyond ITIL change types, which is great as well. That's what we want to see people doing. And really, that's 60% of people who are using the change types, who are using models for change types. We want to see you moving and adopting new models, right? And again, it's on the roadmap to give you a few. We have examples in there, but to give you a bit more guidance around setting those things up, to give a better experience around setting those things up. So from the platform, you can kind of tell how you're meant to go about setting up additional models, because at the moment it's a little bit obscure and hard to find. I'll admit that. We're looking to improve that. And then we've got a roundabout on the other two questions. So I have no idea what you're talking about 9%. And we're not, but talk to me about it. We've got about 20% of people in that category. So again, we're looking to get more materials out. We're looking to advertise it more on the platform, and we're looking to get better documentation and collateral around it so that you understand better and you can take advantage of what's in your platform, right? What you've already paid for. So so we want to make that better for you guys as well. Okay. Should we do some questions? Jason, how do you want to do this?
Yeah, we can do some questions. I think there's a couple of comments in the chat that are really interesting. I think there's we've got a few major kind of areas that have a lot of responses. So one of them was and it's Alan, where he's saying they're considering renaming normal change to custom change to emphasize that each requires its own piece and plans, and to encourage transition to standard changes. We'd like standard changes to be the norm. And then there was a lot of commentary underneath that.
I think I completely get the sentiment there, and I agree with it. What I'd like to see is actually just generally more templating of change, right? So making it easier for you to set up templates and have a catalog of things that you do, like, you know, a specific firewall change that you do, and maybe have approvals in that. Because actually standard change was built for a day when we couldn't really do dynamic approvals all that well. But you think about a standard change, right? It may be that team A are really successful at rebooting the servers and team B are really unsuccessful at it. What you want to be able to do is say, team A, you can do this as a standard change, and team B, we want you to have an approval because it's a bit kind of ropey when you do it. And that would fall into the category of having an approval policy in the change that just checks a success score, right? So we have team success scores in ServiceNow. And you can check the success score of a team, which gives you an idea of, you know, how many outages, P1s, P2s, those kind of things. It gives you a score based on that the last 30 days. And it can actually dynamically route a change for approval based on whether that team is successful or not. And other things as well, you know, if there's a P1 in production right now, it may not be appropriate to start rebooting servers, even though that's normally a standard change. So what I'd like to see is an extension of the use of templates within ServiceNow change, so that we can begin to start looking at, you know, having that, I think it was on the slide previously, I'll click on it before, we had low risk change down the bottom there, which is changes that we see as being kind of low risk, but falling outside the boundaries of what we see at the moment as being, you know, that kind of very rigid standard change, which you need to really tie down what that thing is, but maybe have some changes which still have templates, but you can apply approval policies, you can allow them to flow through. Maybe it's sub prod, maybe it's in a maintenance window, you allow it to go through that approval. But if it's during a blackout window, or there's a P1 right now, you may need an approval. And again, that's the direction I'd like to take things as the change product manager for ServiceNow. I want to see the ability to expand on what we do in that kind of standard paradigm, but again, using models for it. So the idea of standard change, completely agree, but I want to make it kind of bigger and more flexible.
Yeah, that's great. There's another one. Thank you for the answer. That's great. Is there some sort of, and this was from Jackie M, change taxonomy for change owners? And that goes back to like giving some direction and guidance to the actual owners around this, so they will select the correct categories before arriving at the appropriate change model and form. Is that?
Yeah. So change models allow you to set who can read them. So we either use user criteria, which is like for the catalog, right? So you can say a whole load of different queries to make this specific group able to use this type of change. You can say that this group can't look at this change. So the idea is when you arrive at that change form in SOW, which is where, sorry, Service Operations Workspace, when you arrive in that form, it should only present you with the changes that you're meant to be using. And that's one of the cool things about models is that, you know, with normal change, you have to give someone a normal change and then throw that big old form at them. And then you have to give them guidance about what they're meant to fill in and what they're not meant to fill in and how the process will work for them. Whereas if you have a model, you can tailor specifically and say, okay, you're going to go to this model because you're one of the infra teams and you're not going to be able to open that changes because you're one of the infra teams. Why would you be opening that change? And then we're looking to extend that further and say, actually, the entry point may be a template for your particular model. So maybe we have 50 different templates. I've worked at banks where they have 3,000 or 4,000 templates for changes. So so yeah, we'd like to expand on that, but you can limit already out of the box, you can limit or restrict who can see certain models of change.
Okay, yeah, that's a good one. There are a couple other questions around the operating model around it, because I think that's where people are, because of the different models and the governance. I think that's what some of the questions around, you know. So one of them was from Althena. So is the theory that the change process owner is more looking at data and going back to the change managers on specific teams when they're authorized, automated, or internally approved?
Yeah, to handle the velocity of change and the volume of change that's hitting our organizations. Like, you know, I was talking to a big bank the other day and they were looking at 750,000 changes a year a couple of years ago, 1 million changes a year last year, 2 million changes this year.
Wow.
You know, it's now doubling.
Right.
And the ability to process that, the change process owners, and even the change managers, they can't be looking at individual changes anymore. They need to be looking across the picture and being able to say, okay, this is where we think we have problems. This is what we need to start improving on. And this is a potential model that we could use to make things faster so that we can put this in this particular box and, you know, template it and allow it to flow a bit faster and worry about it less. So again, you know, improving the product, looking at finding ways that a process owner in the widest sense can look at how their process is performing. And then surfacing that, you know, to other areas of the product, like for DevOps, we have time to value. So you can tell how long it took from a story being approved to a pipeline running and getting into production. For other changes, it's a little bit harder to assess that, but we want to know how long a change spent in approval. Because if we're seeing a high amount of time in approval, that means our changes are slow. Because generally approval is the thing that slows down change, right? Not another thing. So we want to start surfacing more data to allow the change managers to step back into a kind of more second line role, more of a governance role. Second thing is, in terms of governance, you will still have your documents around normal standard emergency change. And the whole point of the models, the way we've done models, is you keep them as they are because they're going to stay that way. But you can do an addendum that starts looking at things like, okay, we have these particular states, we have these approval policies, we have these flows, these are the ones we want to use. And actually, that tells us things like, you know, when you look at your COBIT requirements or ISO 27000 or 27001, that says a change will be appropriately approved. It's like we do it through approval policies. These are our approval policies. And then the change itself will be a set of defined approval policies. And then we measure it by making sure that we're looking back on changes and we don't have impact from our changes when we didn't think they were, the risk is appropriately calculated. So there are ways of making sure as well within change models that we have compliance.
Good. Yeah, that's let's see some of the other questions. I mean, some of them are I think you're presenting, you might not be able to see the chat window, but there's a lot of discussion around examples of these. Do we have like kind of real world examples from a ServiceNow perspective of the models?
Of models? Yeah.
Yeah.
So DevOps is the one I chose for this primarily because it's kind of easiest for us to get our heads around, because DevOps has all that shift left data embedded. So it's like obviously a different way of doing change, where you're saying we're going to delegate responsibility to you guys in your DevOps pipeline for making sure that change you're doing is fit for purpose and fit to go into production. We're going to make sure that, and you will just report to us that the test results, you know, you had 70% pass for your unit testing and 100% passes on your security scans, that you had branch protection enabled on your pipeline, and that all the work items had a story attached to them. And we'll test that and we'll report it on the change, so you're compliant. But we're not having someone manually approve and look at those things, and we're not asking them to cut and paste. The second thing is, it's very obvious the separation of release and deploy for DevOps as well. So for DevOps, it's DevOps pipelines running is effectively a deployment activity. The release activity, the release train, is separate. So that's why I chose it as an example. But you know, you have infra works differently for organizations. A lot of them are doing models for starting off with something like firewalls and rolling it out from there. Cloud, the other example we've got on here. So you know, you have cloud and ephemeral resources where you may not be doing full DevOps, but the way in which it works means that your change process is slightly different for those teams, and it's highly federated. We gave the example of low risk change, so stuff that doesn't really fit in the standard change box, but is really like normal change is really heavy handed for. So that's another example of where that happens. So
measurements for those, so they're like metrics or measurements to determine between what a low risk and normal change is, and guidelines around that. Is it
yeah, so it's so if you're repeating something a lot, if you have a template for it, what you want to do is we are working with customers to figure out ways that they can automatically identify what should be a model. So using things like clustering, we need to improve how we use clustering in the platform to do it. And a lot of the experiments we're doing as a product team right now are about that type of paradigm, which is we can present to you, maybe through generative AI or maybe just through clustering or machine learning, we can say to you, this thing looks like a template to us, right? Or this thing fails a lot and probably shouldn't be a standard change.
right?
And you may want to have some approvals in it.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting.
So features to look out for, and I'm a product manager, so I do talk about features, although there is a lot more than features to getting this embedded in an organization, and we all know that because I worked in implementation too. But features to look out for are success scores. So using success scores, using approval policies. Success scores help you measure things, so a model or a team can be measured. And also using predictive intelligence, so looking at the risks of changes, things that are regularly coming up as low risk in that, clustering on them and working out whether there's a particular. But actually, for the first few group of models, when you go out to the organization, they already know what they want to see, right? DevOps, site reliability engineering, patching, network changes. They're all kind of already like, yes, we want to do that. That works for us. And that's what we're seeing with customers. So that's the real life example I can give you.
And then there were some questions around quality versus velocity. And I think there's some, and I guess maybe you can comment on that, like the quality of the change versus the velocity and the faster changing, you know, so there was some commentary about, we're talking a lot about velocity, but not as much about quality. And I don't know, maybe you can comment on that.
So velocity, volume, stability, compliance, right? That's the change envelope. So you want to be able to handle, we have to handle more volume because more volume is hitting us. And that means change managers need to start monitoring more. And we need to have kind of dynamic, reactive policies around how things are approved. So as things start failing, we put more approvals in. As things are more successful, we take approvals out. Velocity of change is about collecting data from other sources. So whereas we gave the example of DevOps, which has stories and pipelines, and well, everything's tied together with the pipeline in DevOps, that kind of is what makes it DevOps. And you know, it's a rich source of data we can pull test results from. Other teams use Selenium, right? They use testing tools. Again, we want to be able to tie that into their change, so we can say, okay, well, we still need a business approval on this change. We still need to know the technical architect reviewed it and I have an approval in there, but we have the test results in the change, right, for this particular product. So shift left data is really important as well to that. And there's no correlation between how fast the change moves, so the lead time to change, and stability, right? That's a proven thing in our industry now for change. And actually there's, for a lot of teams, not all, for a lot of teams, there's a proven link between doing things fast and better stability. That's why people like Google promote working with DevOps and DORA metrics. If you need to have a look at DORA metrics offline, if you want to have a look at what they're measuring there. But ways of measuring how a team are performing, you know, in a kind of high velocity paradigm. But the point of models is you can have low velocity stuff as well in there, right? Patching can be quite low velocity in terms of the overall time it takes from raising a change through to it actually happening. You could be doing it 6 months in advance. There's nothing wrong with that either. We just need to have a model that's specific for the speed at which it's moving.
Okay. Yeah, there's a number of other ones. I think we're starting to run a little bit on time, but I mean, I think this is very helpful. We can let me see if I can find another couple interesting questions.
So while you're looking at that, I just one thing to say. So we are running a set of things called launch and learns, and they'll be on YouTube, right? And you'll be able to get them on YouTube. Change management launch and learns around models, approval policies, dynamic risk, you know, using flow instead of workflow. Those things, we're having specific topics. We're limiting the number of customers coming to them because what we want to do is have a small set of customers that we can have a kind of meaningful question and answer that we then record and report back on. And we want to have engineers on, we will have engineers on that call as well from the product team who can answer very specific questions with customers who have hit things having done this. And the idea is we get quite a kind of real life scenario rather than me presenting on a new concept. We'll also be hosting a webinar on this kind of wider topic again, recording that and putting it out there. So there will be material being promoted on change management, on modern change management over the next couple of months. And we'll be revisiting that, and we will be more and more looking to kind of embed some guided setup and help within the product to guide you to the right places. Because I would say right now, if I was a customer asked to set up these things in ServiceNow, I'd find it really tricky to know where to go and what set up and what the things were. And as the product manager, I want to make that easier for people. So, you know, my focus right now is not features for change. We've got a whole bunch of features, right? We don't need more features. What we need is features that help people use the features. And that's where the focus is.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to take control and appreciate it. Let me go back to my share. And just wrap up here. And again, thank you very much, Daniel. That was very helpful. I think there's a very interesting subject. I think a lot of commentary in the chat. And just for the members, you can provide feedback on our community. So feel free to go through if you didn't get your question answered here and you do want to get a response, feel free to go out to the community and go ahead and post your question there on the content link that once John posts the videos.
I will definitely be reviewing the feedback. So if you have feedback on the presentation, the scope of the presentation, or just questions you didn't get answered or things you need answered, I would love to hear that. Or if you've been doing this or you want to do it and you can't find the material you need, or you feel technically blocked in some way, or from an organizational point of view blocked, that's kind of the number one priority for me right now, is getting that feedback on how to adopt change so we can make it better. So please post feedback on the forum and I will look for it.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. Appreciate it. Look forward to it. We'll post the results on the forum, and you can pull the videos and replay that as well. So anything you want to follow up on, and then obviously you can send an email to myself or John if you wanted to get more information. So thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.